I think it's important that there is a kind of metropolitan revolution going on in places like the United States, partly because they haven't got a central government that's helping them very much and haven't had for years, really. So there's a lot of innovation going on. But they've got lots of local tax raising powers in American cities, so they can do things like bonds, and they can raise local tax from sales tax to do infrastructure. But I like the phrase, the metropolitan revolution. I think we should try and copy some of it across the world, but it involves giving more powers to cities, particularly income gathering, and it particularly hits the subtitle of this conference around people, density and infrastructure, because in Australian cities we're building roads largely because we can, and we can afford them through user charges, not because they're necessarily the best mode to build. And I'm going to argue that actually they're not the best mode to build from a modern city perspective, and that actually we need the help of the tall buildings builders, who I think have got a complicity, a positive one, with mass transit. I think they fit together very well, and I'm going to talk about that. So we haven't got much multi-tier government in Australian cities, and that's usually quite useful too. But there are city deals coming, and if people don't know what they are the feds and the state government and working with local government around a common strategy. In Sydney, it's around Western Sydney. This is very welcome, and it's not happened before. So we haven't got much metropolitan governance, and anybody who lived in London in the 80s and 90s saw how bad London was managed without city-wide coordination. So I'm a believer in it, and I'm going to talk about it. There's a kind of double devolution thing in my head, which is that we devolve power to the cities, but then the cities have to show how they're going to engage citizens and businesses in common problem solving. And I'm going to talk a bit about that too. So that's called network government, I think. So it isn't that government does it all itself. I think also we've got digital brings real opportunities to co-produce cities, to actually engage citizens, much more than like 19th century meetings, which people don't want to go to. You know, we call the community 10 people who turn up to oppose a development. That's not the community, so there may be more productive dialogues to have with people online. And there is a bit of a small revolution underway in Sydney in metropolitan governance terms, because we've got this new vehicle called the Greater Sydney Commission, which is a cross-government collaboration tool. It doesn't exist in other parts of Australia. It's a good thing. And the business community approves of it. Now, I've alluded to this already. Part of what I'm going to do is, and I know the best architects and thinkers about these things always reach beyond the building. It's really important at a time when opposition to development is growing, that we really reach out and understand not just the impact we have with our buildings, but how we are building places rather than just buildings. I think the bottom one is important to me. The bottom two, I want to talk about a social license to operate in cities. Do we have, at the moment, is there so much opposition in some parts that we don't have a social license to grow the city? And I think the last bit is part of the rationale we need to make, is that everything people like about a city actually is about well-functioning agglomeration and density, and they're the two most hated words in the alphabet. And actually, you can't have a public transport world without density. So this sector is at the heart of a successful city, but I don't think we're selling it very well. Anyway, who the hell am I? I always do this because I think it's quite funny. So I used to work for Tony Blair, and I didn't know he was a liar at all, you know, sort of. Of course I didn't. And then I worked for Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London, who keeps great company, and I was in his company for a while. And then I came to Australia, and I live in Manly, and Tony Abbott is the member for Manly, and that's a private joke. So, but I'm going to talk about buildings and governance. It's a cliche you can't see enough of. Les Murray, a great Australian poet, said of this that it wasn't until Sydney-siders saw the theatre of the century, he said, go up, that they realised that they weren't a far-flung outpost of a fallen empire, but a world city. So great buildings can do that for you, but I worry that we wouldn't have the nerve today to approve it. I think that one of the newspapers might try and kill it. So I think engaging the community in governance matters in great city building. Just my own experience. So I spent a lot of years in London, particularly around this place. And this is near Paternoster Square, but essentially the city of corporation, the square mile governance of London didn't really want to grow very much in the 1970s for protectionist reasons. And so they limited development in a very serious way, and it led to what I think of as the Battle of Canary Wharf. You can see Canary Wharf and the Daleks in the background. There is an episode of Doctor Who about this, but really it was about this, which is that the city corporation, the 1 square mile, didn't want competition and actually joined in with councils in this area of East London to oppose the London Docklands Development Corporation taking their planning powers away. But the result was this. And so governance lesson number 1 is there are tools that can make cities, and maybe we haven't got them at the moment. The Development Corporation is a good one. But 110,000 people now work there, earning on average $175,000 each. There was nobody there in 1981, but the basis of it was public transport, fast public transport to there by underground. And by the way, if anybody's interested in infrastructure appraisal, it only got 1.1 from the Treasury because they were thinking of travel time reduction rather than city shaping. I mean, can you imagine London without Canary Wharf? But that's what would have happened with a conventional approach. Now, the city response was this, which is, in 30 years, it's quite dramatic, but just to put it in context, there are now 450 planned projects over 20 stories in about 5 local government areas in and around that area, and one of them, Tower Hamlets, has 93 projects over 20 stories, and the tallest residential tower in, I think, Europe, actually, it's 270 meters, called the Hartsmere. So something profoundly shifted and changed in terms of response to this kind of development. But it's changing again because 450 is a lot, and The Guardian started kicking off about the quality of what they're calling a skyscraper free-for-all in London. So there is now some kickback and slowing down. It's ever thus in a democracy, and you always have to win the argument for these things. But I just thought it was interesting as a kind of history of yin and yang, of where there was opposition. Then there was a creative response to some of it. It's seen massive growth in East London, but now it's coming under pressure again. And this is partly why some of these things come under pressure, even though this is an extraordinarily bad case of regulation, I think we'll find. People are still asking questions about residential towers and safety, and we have to respond to it, I think. Now, come to this city and make no criticism whatsoever, because this is just a controversial development now. And if you look at it, I think you'll see that that's a lot of towers in a place. And part of the problem, I think, with this is the communication around this. That doesn't look like a very uplifting drawing. Drawings can kill in this discussion about density. It's actually a really good development, but I don't think it's conveyed very well. But also the community asks, what will it mean for us in terms of the quality of our life around all this stuff? And I think that the opposition to density is not about architecture and design. It's about the place that's created by growth and the overselling that is done actually by the public sector, who doesn't turn up on time with the schools, with the hospital places, with the public transport. And part of the opposition to density is actually a public sector problem, not an architecture problem. And just to show how controversial this is becoming, we now have the two newspapers in the city in quite opposite camps about growth. The bottom right-hand side is the Telegraph saying, carry on, Premier, just build, build, build. And the top is the Sydney Morning Herald saying, we're full. So it's become everyday politics. And I just want to explain some of the rationality behind all this, and then ask questions about how we can work public-privately to improve not just the reception of big growth, but actually the design of it. So this is the strategic design problem with Sydney. The red is the rail system, and the blue is the higher than average density of development. And you can see that it's been disconnecting from the public transport network, and I think part of the opposition to growth in Sydney is around this chart. And we need to do better than that in terms of land use and transport integration. It's also leading to an unwalkable Western Sydney, because people walk to public transport, and where there is no public transport to walk to, they don't walk. And so we've got diabetes exploding in Western Sydney. But we've also got a big population explosion all over the city. This is just to show you the global context for Sydney's growth. It's growing at 100,000 people a year, which is far bigger than Toronto or London. So that's big, and bigger than we've seen for some time. How do we manage that growth has become a huge topic. Now, who are the people coming is really interesting. This was a bit of a joke thing done by a demographer. He refers to the inner city of about the first 10 kilometers, where there are fewer people from China living, as the goat's cheese curtain, because he claims there is goat's cheese in the fridge of the yuppies who live in the inner ring. But you can see that, in a sense, China isn't out there for Sydney. This is increasingly going to be part of a Chinese community, and I think it's a false way of looking at the world. So where is Sydney economically? Why are they coming? Have a look at this. So this is Sydney's financial services, and Sydney CBD alone in the green, and the yellow is the yellow is mining, and the green is financial services. That's just the Sydney CBD matching the contribution of mining to the national economy in terms of GDP. This is the international perception of Sydney as an increasingly important financial services centre in the Asia-Pacific region, the yellow. And for anybody who thinks we've got a problem, the private sector may be growing, but what about the public sector? That orange shows that Australia is one of the lowest publicly indebted countries in the world, despite the palaver there was a couple of years ago. We've got loads of money. Government is well off in comparison with most other people. Do we want to spend our money on our infrastructure to accommodate this growth is the real question. The other thing is national GDP has gone up 27% since the global crash. In Britain, it's gone up 9%. We've also got the third biggest pension pot on the planet. So, it's a wealthy country getting wealthier. It can choose to be great. And its cities are at the heart of its future. So this is the 20 commercial hottest spots on the planet in 2015, 2016. There's a geography to this, the southeast of the world, reinforced by this wonderful thing from McKinsey, which shows at the bottom right-hand corner, the center of the world's wealth 2,000 years ago, trekking to the northwest in the Industrial Revolution, winging its way back inexorably to its natural home in China, hovering strangely over Kazakhstan at the moment, but I think that's a statistical matter. And then you got this. So it's not just wealth growing in certain geography of the world, it's the population of our cities. So that's now, and that's then. So, even in terms of urban explosions, it's going to be the southeast of the world. And we're part of this universe in Australia, it seems to me. And in fact, so much so, that's the way to understand the world. The south is the north of the 21st century. Okay? Now, I'm going to come to some of the political problems of this growth model now. So this is an amazing chart by Brankovich. On the left-hand side is the rise of the Chinese working class. In the middle is the stalling of the American middle class, and then the right-hand side is the rise of the 1%. That on one chart you could do an hour's conversation about. Australia's doing better in terms of working class share of income and wealth, but it makes you think, right? So that whenever somebody says, like me, the financial services are really important, look at all the jobs we're creating, people look at that chart and say, well, it's not a fair distribution. So I think there's something to be discussed around the benefit of the world that we're all in to that not 1%. It's real, but I think the narrative we've been having around this has been very narrow. We need to broaden the public understanding of the benefits of some of the things that we're doing. Because they see this, which is the affordability chart, which we're top of, and then actually they look at the problems we're having around high costs, infrastructure investment demands, social cohesion, integration, and they begin to ask, who's the city for? And have my children got a part in this city? And I think that's become the biggest discussion, certainly in sort of Western, fast-growing democracies. How do we fit into this great city of yours? And I think public sector has been very poor at finding answers to this question, and they need the private sector and are looking to us, I think, to step up. That collaboration is what I will conclude with when I get there. So we did a survey of what Sydney's great at and what it's not, and its livability is eroding. Because 10 years ago when they used to do these charts, livability meant beach, and now it means access to the beach. And if it takes an hour and a half to get there, that's not a livable access to the beach. So I think the livability of Sydney, which is crucial in a knowledge economy, is beginning to erode because of these pressures. We've also got, as all cities have economic splits, but this is quite an interesting one. This is the split between the bit that's closest to the CBD and then the bit that's not. And there's a new airport coming to the far west, and we're hoping that will change the equation. But never forget that chart. It shows the wealth difference. Then it shows a dynamic that's still working. These yellow bits are the knowledge jobs, the high-value knowledge jobs, which are increasingly agglomerating and congregating in Western cities around CBDs. 50 years ago, we couldn't give away living near the inner city. Everybody now wants to live near the inner city because that's where the knowledge jobs are agglomerating. And boy, are we seeing the effects of this economic agglomeration. Now, The positives of this are the value that's created in a place like Barangaroo, and you just can't get the productivity and the payback for the nation from almost any other sector. Connecting to it is the issue rather than attacking it, it seems to me. Connecting to it better. How we managed to create this in the first version without public transport is a mystery. Canary Wharf has 90% of workers accessed by public transport. So in the backdrop, behind the building of tall buildings, these processes are going on, right? So here's another one. Employers who are looking to hire the best people will always follow the talent. An out-of-town business park isn't going to attract the best talent today. People want to be in lively and vibrant places. So we're rediscovering not just the virtues of agglomeration, but actually that certain places create value. And so it becomes really important to preserve and access those places. And by the way, since agglomeration is working at such a level of intensity like Barangaroo, the discussion must be about how you get a mass of people into a small number of very high-value places, and that's a mass transit play in an Australian city, and we're a bit slow to pick up on that. We think there's a modal equivalence between roads and rail in running a modern city. There isn't. Roads disperse a city, rail concentrates a city, and they fit very well with the density future that we have. And it also means, by the way, that if the knowledge economy needs place management, then the private sector has to get really interested in the way the public sector is managing places. And I think that's a critical discussion line, that is the one I will conclude with for a little bit of a thing around walkability. If anybody doubts this, have a look at everything's leading to density, well-managed density, access to walkable precincts are the value in the market, commercially and residentially. Christopher Leinberg has just studied 60 top metros in the US, and it comes out with that for the first time in a generation, the walkable precincts have a huge advantage over the unwalkable, the drivable suburban. A lot of Australia is drivable suburban. We have to win the battle with the public for walkable urban because it benefits economically and socially everybody. They don't believe it. And I think it's really difficult to build an urban city in an otherwise suburban sprawl, but we are attempting to do so and must get there. So I think walkable development is becoming the market. And just to show you the spatial challenge, all the densities in the east of Sydney. So all the walkable precincts are east of Parramatta, hugely so. And that's, I think, a massive challenge going forward in this city. Why should we bother? This is a chart from England of the density of employment equating to higher wages. So the denser city is actually the better off city. It creates more jobs for working class people as well. What are we doing? We're dispersing the city through road investment. This is not a Sydney issue. This is an Australian cities discussion. It's an American cities discussion. We need to turn this discussion around and the mode shift required. And with AVs coming, if we have that paradigm, we'll carry on dispersing the city. We need to have the kind of compact city paradigm when we come to discuss AVs. So some cities are sort of getting this, and this is Seoul, which is an otherwise terrible city, doing this. Effectively taking out some of its old-style motorways and putting in something a higher value, which is actually creating a value uplift around it, and then they're using that to fund public transport. All these are clues, it seems to me, keys to what we need to be thinking about. Our dispersed city model is terribly expensive for the public sector to run. It costs 3 times more for government to run a dispersed city than it does for a concentrated city. And the environmental emissions, you've got Atlanta on the left-hand side and you've got Barcelona on the right. A low-density, car-driven city versus a high-density public transport city. Which one do you want? We're coming to the point where these choices are not just environmental choices, they're economic choices. And just to nail that, walkable places are more successful as well as healthy. This is the research from America. So, 4.5 minutes. What model of growth? This is the sort of received suburban one. And my friends in Lendlease, who I used to work for, would call that something Springs, I think. So I joke with them, not hope, I think. So, but is that the future instead of? There's no social license for this model in Sydney, but I think it's coming in some form. And we can't seem to get to the kind of mixed version of the two, which is the higher density 4 to 5 stories residential mixed use Barcelona street. This is a new one. planning regulations of overshadowing and transport roads sort of forbid this kind of model, but I think it's a pretty good model. So we need conversations about the model of growth. What do we mean by high density? What's it look like? How does it work? Now, to answer all this, we've got some new governance arrangements in Sydney, which I think might help Australia, actually. So this is the Greater Sydney Commission, which is a coming together of government departments and planning and land use transport at its heart, which is essentially saying there isn't a city of 6 million or 5 million on its own. There are not just 45 Sydneys, there are 3, the eastern, the central now, and the west. And whether or not you agree entirely with this, it is a high concept of trying to get 3 30-minute cities to an otherwise very, very difficult sprawling city. So the idea is to actually concentrate transport and economic thinking around the 3 cities and the access to their centres. So that instead of everybody trying to get to the CBD, we're going to try and get to 3 economic centres. And as I said, behind all that is a new form of governance city deal with the feds. My challenge for all of this is that this is how government does business at the moment. Anybody who's ever worked in business, try to get an answer out of government that's not about procurement, or if you've ever been a community activist, they secret squirrel, do all the things like this, and all of a sudden, a day before the announcement, they'll ring you and say, you do support us, don't you? And we say, we haven't done a bloody thing about it. So that's how they normally work. This is how in the new city they should work, which is to turn it upside down and share the problem analysis and problem solving with the widest group possible, using online methods, it seems to me, but the community, business. Tell us what are the challenges in this city, and think of the 5 things that might answer that, rather than the rush to procure an infrastructure solution which is just based on one mode and one way of raising money. So I think we need a lot more around that. I think the way we fund our cities is flawed. Value capture must come, which is about value uplift from public infrastructure. We're creating an airport in Western Sydney that is making millionaires out of private sector landlords at this point in time. Nobody would blame us, the government, nobody, if we taxed those people for the benefit of providing the infrastructure which made them rich. That is the only way to do a model of city going forward. We need to find the money to do the infrastructure. We can't just tap car using user charges all the time. So we need a better way of appraising city infrastructure, and we need further innovation in governance in Australian cities, borrowing from the best around the world. London's done better with its mayoral model than it was doing before. Cities actually need 4 teams, but the one I'm going to sort of conclude about is the last one, which is all successful cities have non-procurement relationships with business leaders. And it's actually more and more important with cities lacking the resources that they find better ways of dealing with the private sector. And I actually think in an era in which the private sector, development sector is facing some opposition to its growth model and to building the denser city, that the collaboration with government needs to get better, not more strained. It needs to get more creative. And I think that's a challenge to us all. Just come back from the States where they got lots of business improvement districts, and that's just one model of the private sector putting its skin in the game. And I think that should be looked at. If you've ever been to Bryant Park, which is run by a genius called Dan Biederman, he's raised the value of all the private sector tall buildings around. In fact, more coming, because this place has been rehabilitated as a former Needle Park in the heart of Manhattan by the private sector, working with a creative public sector. These are models we can just steal. We don't have to be original geniuses. We just have to borrow the best city models out there, because our own models are stalling at this point in time, I think, in Australia. And somebody reminded me, to conclude my last 2 slides, that actually this would be permitted under the City of Sydney tall building planning rules, because it's got a really good setback and it doesn't overshadow. By which I mean that was a huge symbolic taking forward of the modern city, and it excited people across town. What's our next move to do that? And I'm going to end with my list of not as exciting as that, but some thoughts about what to do. And literally, it will take a minute. What will give us a social license to operate in a modern city in terms of the density that we need? What are the breakthrough ideas? I think green is non-negotiable. And I don't just mean within a building. I mean, we need to be doing green streets, green neighbourhoods, supporting the green grid across Sydney. I think co-producing with the community is a bit fancy, but it literally means starting earlier in the engagement process rather than a row at a development application meeting. Density done well as the core of our collaboration, not just architecture, but government is crucial to that, government coordination. Mass transit is not some 19th century fantasy, but actually core to the modern city, with AVs collaborating as part of it, but mass transit, not. We must get beyond the car era in our denser city. And making the city in a digital era, we're at the beginning of that journey. Nobody knows quite what it can do, but it will be transformational, and that's for sure. And I think the last thing is this. Our cities need a new kind of public-private partnership to help run them. That's not, I don't just mean a development vehicle or a contractual proposition. I mean collaboration. Cities collaborate to compete. We need to start that today. Thank you very much.